Good evening, my friend. Tonight, I want to share something with you. Something that happened nearly 1500 years ago. Something so catastrophic that it nearly ended human civilization as we know it. Imagine waking up one morning. You stretch, you yawn, you walk outside expecting to see the sunrise, but something is wrong. The sun is there, yet it's not really there. It hangs in the sky like a pale ghost, like looking at the moon during the daytime, dim, weak, wrong. Now imagine that this doesn't last a day. It doesn't last a week. It lasts for 18 months straight. The sun refuses to shine properly. Crops begin to wither. Snow falls in summer. And across the world, people start to starve. This isn't a myth. This isn't a legend. This actually happened. In the year 536 AD, the world went dark. Tonight, as you settle in and let your body relax, we're going to journey together through the most catastrophic year in recorded human history. We'll discover what caused the sun to disappear. We'll walk through the streets of Constantinople as a great plague swept through. We'll see empires crumble and civilizations transform forever. But here's what I find most remarkable about this story. It's not just about darkness and death, it's about survival. It's about the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people who lived through the unlivable. And ultimately, it's about how the light returned, because the light always returns. You see, there's something deeply comforting about understanding history. When we learn what our ancestors endured and how they persevered, it puts our own challenges into perspective. The world has faced darkness before, and it has always found its way back to the light. So tonight, let your breathing slow, let your muscles soften. There's nothing you need to do right now except rest and listen. I'll guide you through this forgotten catastrophe, not with urgency or anxiety, but with the calm wonder of someone sharing a remarkable story by the fireside. We're going to travel back in time together, back to a world of ancient empires and distant lands, back to a moment when everything changed. And as we explore this history, may it carry you gently into peaceful sleep. So let's begin, shall we? Let's travel back to a world that was about to be plunged into the longest darkness humanity has ever known. Before we explore the darkness, let me paint for you a picture of the light. Let me show you the world as it existed in early 536 AD, because to truly understand how devastating this catastrophe was, you first need to see what was lost. Picture the Mediterranean world in the early 6th century. The Roman Empire, or at least the eastern half of it, was experiencing something of a golden age. In Constantinople, the magnificent capital that straddled Europe and Asia, the Emperor Justinian sat upon his throne with grand ambitions. He dreamed of nothing less than restoring the glory of ancient Rome. And for a moment, it seemed like that dream might actually come true. Justinian had already reconquered North Africa from the Vandals. His generals were pushing into Italy, reclaiming the ancient heartland of the empire. The great church of Hagia Sophia was under construction, a building so magnificent that when Justinian finally saw it completed, he reportedly whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." Now, here's what most people don't realize about this period. The world was remarkably connected. Trade routes stretched from the British Isles all the way to China. Silk from the Far East arrived in Roman markets. Spices from India flavored Byzantine cuisine. Gold from sub-Saharan Africa filled imperial treasuries. The world was smaller than we might imagine, and it wasn't just Rome that was thriving. The Sasanian Persian Empire to the east was equally powerful and sophisticated. In China, the northern and southern dynasties were producing art, literature, and innovations that would shape Asian civilization for centuries. In Mesoamerica, the great city of Teotihuacan housed perhaps 200,000 people, one of the largest cities on Earth. The climate had been favorable for decades. Harvests were generally good. Populations were growing. There was conflict, certainly. There's always conflict in human history. But there was also optimism, expansion, building. The sense that tomorrow would be better than today. Merchants traveled well worn roads and sea lanes. Scholars debated philosophy in great libraries. Farmers planted their crops each spring with reasonable confidence that autumn would bring a harvest. This was the rhythm of life that people knew, the rhythm they trusted. But here's the fascinating part, and I want you to remember this as we continue our journey tonight. Not a single person in that world, not the emperor, not the merchants, not the farmers, not the scholars, had any idea what was coming. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, deep beneath the earth, pressure was building, magma was rising, forces beyond human comprehension were preparing to reshape the planet. And when that pressure finally released, nothing would ever be quite the same again. In early 536 AD, the world was full of life and ambition and hope. People went about their daily routines, they complained about taxes, they celebrated festivals, they fell in love, they raised children. They had no way of knowing that within months, everything they knew would begin to unravel. But nobody knew. Nobody could have known. And this brings us to something equally fascinating. The first strange reports began to arrive in Constantinople during the spring. Travelers spoke of a peculiar fog, a haze that seemed to dim the very sun itself. At first, people dismissed it as unusual weather, a curiosity, nothing more. They were wrong. March of 536, Hieraudi. Spring was arriving in Constantinople. The days should have been growing longer, brighter, warmer. Flowers should have been blooming in the imperial gardens, but instead, something strange was happening in the sky. A Byzantine historian named Procopius was living in Constantinople during this time. He served as a secretary to the great general Belisarius, and he had a gift for careful observation. What he recorded about that spring has haunted historians ever since. Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. Think about that for a moment. Not a brief eclipse, not a passing storm. The sun itself, appearing as dim as moonlight, for an entire year. He went on to describe how it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. The most powerful light in our sky, reduced to a ghostly shadow of itself. People could look directly at it without squinting. That's how dim it had become. Now, let me share what it must have felt like to experience this. You wake up expecting a normal spring morning, but the light feels wrong. It's like perpetual twilight. Colors seem muted. Shadows are strange. And no matter how high the sun climbs in the sky, that pale, sickly quality never goes away. At first, people probably assumed it would pass. Weather does strange things sometimes. Everyone has seen unusual fog or haze, but days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and the sun never returned to normal. Here's the unsettling part that most people never discover. Nobody knew what was causing this. They had no satellites, no scientific instruments, no global communication networks. All they knew was that the sky had changed, and it wasn't changing back. Some blamed divine anger. Surely the gods were displeased. Others suspected dark magic or evil omens. Priests offered sacrifices. People prayed with increasing desperation, but the prayers went unanswered. The haze remained. And it wasn't just the darkness that troubled them. With the dimmed sun came an unexpected and terrible cold. This was supposed to be spring, but the warmth never arrived. Summer approached, and still the cold lingered. Snow fell in months when flowers should have bloomed. Procopius recorded that men were free neither from war, nor pestilence, nor any other thing leading to death. It was as if nature itself had turned against humanity. The very foundations of the world, the reliable rising and setting of a bright sun, had been shaken. What makes this account so valuable is that Procopius was a skeptical, practical man. He wasn't prone to superstition or exaggeration. When he wrote that something was wrong with the sun, he meant it literally. He was describing what he saw with his own eyes. But Constantinople was just one city. And this is where our story becomes even more remarkable, because that strange, dimming haze, that eerie twilight that refused to lift, it wasn't happening only in the Byzantine capital, it was happening everywhere, across oceans, across continents, across the entire world. And that brings us to something truly extraordinary, the realization that this wasn't a local phenomenon, it was planetary. Now, here's where this story becomes truly remarkable. If this strange darkness had only affected Constantinople, we might dismiss it as a regional weather event, an unusual fog, a local anomaly, but the records tell us something far more extraordinary. Thousands of miles to the east, Chinese chroniclers were recording the same phenomenon. In their careful, methodical court records, they noted that during 536 AD, the stars were lost from view for 3 months. Think about what that means. The haze was so thick, so persistent, that even at night, the stars couldn't break through. Chinese records also described summer frost, snow in August, crops withering in fields that should have been green with growth. Famine began to spread through provinces that had known abundance just a year before. But it wasn't just China. Let's travel westward to the green hills of Ireland. The Irish annals, those meticulous records kept by monks in their remote monasteries, described a failure of bread in the year 536. This simple phrase tells us everything. When bread fails, civilization trembles. And here's what makes this even more fascinating. These civilizations had no contact with each other. A Chinese court historian had no way of knowing what an Irish monk was writing. A Byzantine observer couldn't compare notes with a scribe in Scandinavia. Yet they all recorded the same thing, the same darkness, the same cold, the same failing harvests. Scandinavian archaeological evidence paints an even grimmer picture. Researchers have found evidence of massive depopulation during this period. Farms abandoned, villages emptied, gold hoards buried in the ground, perhaps by people hoping to appease angry gods, perhaps by people who never returned to retrieve their treasure. Let's journey even further. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in what we now call Central America, the great city of Teotihuacan was experiencing its own crisis. Tree ring data and archaeological evidence suggest severe drought and agricultural failure during exactly this period. Some researchers believe the catastrophe of 536 may have contributed to Teotihuacan's eventual decline. In the Middle East, Sasanian Persia recorded unusual weather and hardship. In India, chronicles speak of disruption and suffering. From every corner of the inhabited world, the same story emerged: darkness, cold, hunger. But what could possibly cause this? What force could dim the sun across the entire planet simultaneously? What power could reach from Constantinople to China, from Ireland to Mesoamerica, affecting billions of square miles of Earth's surface? This question haunted historians for over 1,000 years. Many simply dismissed the ancient accounts as exaggeration. Surely they thought these chroniclers were being dramatic. Surely the darkness was metaphorical, a way of describing political turmoil or social unrest. But the accounts were too consistent, too detailed, too widespread to ignore. Something real had happened in 536 AD, something that affected the entire world, something that modern science would eventually uncover, though it took nearly 15 centuries to find the answer. And when scientists finally solved the mystery, when they finally understood what had happened, the truth was more terrifying than anyone had imagined. Let me tell you how they found it. For centuries, the events of 536 AD remained a historical curiosity. Scholars knew about the strange accounts from Procopius and others, but without a scientific explanation, many dismissed them as medieval exaggeration. Perhaps they thought these ancient writers were simply superstitious. Perhaps they saw normal weather events through a lens of religious fear. But here's what's fascinating about science. Sometimes the answers to ancient mysteries are hidden in the most unexpected places, and the solution to the puzzle of 536 AD was waiting in ice, frozen, patient, silent for over 1,000 years. In the late 20th century, scientists began drilling deep into the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. These ice cores, cylinders of ancient frozen water pulled from deep beneath the surface, are like time capsules. Each layer represents a year, snowfalls, compresses, becomes ice, and trapped within that ice are tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere, dust, particles, a frozen record of what was in the air centuries ago. When researchers analyzed the ice layers corresponding to 536 AD, they found something remarkable. Massive deposits of sulfate particles, volcanic sulfates, the chemical signature of a catastrophic eruption. Now, let me explain why this matters. When a volcano erupts violently enough, it doesn't just send lava and ash into the local area, it blasts material high into the stratosphere, the upper layer of our atmosphere. And once volcanic particles reach the stratosphere, they don't simply fall back down, they spread. They circulate around the entire globe. They can linger for months, even years. These particles act like a veil between Earth and the Sun. They reflect sunlight back into space before it can reach the surface. The result is exactly what the ancient chroniclers described: a dimmed sun, falling temperatures, failed harvests, darkness. The ice cores told scientists that something enormous had erupted around 536 AD, something powerful enough to affect the entire planet's climate. But here's where the mystery deepened. Which volcano was responsible? Researchers searched for evidence. They looked at known volcanic calderas around the world. They analyzed tephra, volcanic rock fragments from various sites. The investigation took decades. Two main candidates emerged. The first was Ilopango, a massive volcano in what is in now El Salvador. Evidence suggests Ilopango experienced a catastrophic eruption sometime in the 6th century, an eruption so powerful it would have devastated Central America and sent vast quantities of debris into the atmosphere. The second candidate was a volcano in Iceland. Iceland sits on the mid-Atlantic ridge, one of the most volcanically active regions on Earth. An Icelandic eruption could easily have affected the northern hemisphere's climate. Some researchers now believe both theories may be correct. Perhaps multiple eruptions occurred in close succession. Perhaps the planet experienced a chain reaction of volcanic activity, each eruption adding more debris to an already choked atmosphere. And when scientists finally understood the full picture, when they calculated how much material must have entered the stratosphere to cause 18 months of darkness, the scale was almost beyond comprehension. This was one of the most powerful volcanic events in 10,000 years, and humanity had lived through it. But the eruption itself was just the beginning of the nightmare. Let me share something most people never discover about volcanic eruptions. We tend to imagine them as local disasters. A mountain explodes, lava flows, nearby villages are destroyed, but then life returns to normal for everyone except those in the immediate vicinity. The eruption of 536 AD was different, and it was a world-changing event. Consider Ilopango the leading candidate for this catastrophe. Ilopango is a caldera volcano, a special type formed when a massive eruption empties the magma chamber below, causing the ground to collapse into a vast crater. Today, that crater holds a beautiful lake in El Salvador. But 1,500 years ago, It was the site of almost unimaginable destruction. Researchers estimate that the Ilopango eruption may have ejected between 10 and 84 cubic kilometers of material. To put that in perspective, the famous eruption of Mount Vesuvius that buried Pompeii ejected about 3 to 4 cubic kilometers. Ilopango may have been 20 times more powerful, perhaps more. The immediate area would have been devastated beyond recognition. Pyroclastic flows, those terrifying avalanches of superheated gas and rock that move faster than any human can run, would have swept across the landscape. Everything in their path would have been incinerated, towns, villages, forests, fields, all gone in moments. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. The local destruction, as horrible as it was, affected only a relatively small area. The global consequences came from what the volcano sent upward. When a powerful eruption punches through into the stratosphere, it releases enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide. This gas reacts with water vapor to form sulfuric acid droplets. These tiny droplets are incredibly effective at reflecting sunlight. They create what scientists call a volcanic aerosol veil. Imagine wrapping the entire planet in a thin, invisible shroud, a shroud that dims every ray of sunshine that tries to reach the surface. That's what happened in 536 AD, and the effects weren't limited to darkness. Less sunlight means less warmth. Global temperatures dropped dramatically. Tree ring analysis shows that 536 AD was one of the coldest years of the past 2,000 years. In some regions, temperatures may have dropped by 3 to 4 degrees Celsius below normal. That might not sound like much, but here's what most people don't realize about climate. Human civilization, our agriculture, our cities, our societies, is calibrated to very specific temperature ranges. A drop of just 2 or 3 degrees can be catastrophic. It shortens growing seasons. It kills crops that were perfectly suited to the normal climate. It transforms fertile land into frozen wasteland. The volcano didn't just change the weather for a few weeks, it initiated a climate shift that would last for years. Harvests failed not just in 536, but in 537 and 538 and beyond. The cold persisted. The suffering accumulated, and for the millions of people living through this, they had no way of understanding what was happening, no science to explain it, no forecast to predict when it would end, just endless gray skies and growing hunger. But even famine wasn't the worst of what was coming. Let me paint for you a picture of what life was like during those 18 months of darkness, because the historical records give us glimpses, fragments of human experience during the most challenging period our species had faced in millennia. Imagine being a farmer in the Byzantine countryside. You've planted your crops as your father taught you, as his father taught him. You know the rhythms of the seasons like you know your own heartbeat. You trust the sun to ripen your grain. You trust the warmth to coax vegetables from the soil, but the warmth never comes. Day after day, you look up at that pale, sickly sun. You wait for it to break through the haze. You pray for normal weather to return, but the cold persists. The twilight continues, and your crops begin to die. The Chinese records are particularly detailed about this period. They describe summer snowfall, an almost incomprehensible phenomenon in regions accustomed to warm, humid summers. Frost killed crops that should have been thriving. Rice paddies that normally overflowed with abundance produced meager yields, or nothing at all. In the Mediterranean, people who had never experienced severe cold found themselves shivering through seasons that should have been warm. The concept of winter in July was simply beyond their understanding. Some must have thought the world itself was dying. Here's what most people don't realize about ancient agriculture. There was no margin for error. There were no supermarkets, no international food shipments, no strategic grain reserves sufficient to feed entire populations. Each region depended almost entirely on its own harvest. When that harvest failed, People starved, and the harvest didn't just fail once, it failed repeatedly. Because the volcanic aerosols lingered in the atmosphere far longer than anyone could have imagined. The cold persisted through 536, through 537, and into subsequent years. Consider what this meant for ordinary people. A family that managed to survive the first failed harvest by eating their seed grain now had nothing to plant for the following year. Communities that shared resources during the first winter of scarcity found those resources exhausted by the second. The safety nets unraveled one by one. The wealthy fared better, of course, they always do, but even the richest households felt the pinch as food prices soared and supplies dwindled. The Byzantine government struggled to maintain order as hunger spread through city streets. Animals died too. Livestock that depended on grazing found pastures frozen or barren. Horses and cattle perished. With them went transportation, agricultural labor, the muscle power that human civilization depended upon. And through all of this, that pale sun hung in the sky like a bad omen. People couldn't escape the constant visual reminder that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with the world. Now, imagine being a farmer watching your fields freeze in July. Imagine explaining to your children why there isn't enough food. Imagine the desperation, the fear, the prayers that went unanswered. And yet, as terrible as this sounds, famine wasn't the worst thing coming. Something far more terrible was breeding in the shadows of this weakened world. The famine that followed the darkness of 536 was unlike anything the ancient world had experienced. Local famines were common enough in history, a drought here, a flood there, a region suffering while neighboring areas prospered. But this was different. This famine was everywhere, simultaneously, across continents, across oceans. There was nowhere to import food from because everyone was struggling. Let me share something about human behavior during extreme food scarcity. At first, people maintain their dignity, they share what little they have, communities pull together, but as the months drag on, as hunger transforms from discomfort into desperation, the bonds of civilization begin to fray. Byzantine records describe grain prices climbing to astronomical levels. A measure of wheat that once cost a modest sum became worth its weight in gold. Those who had stored grain before the crisis became wealthy beyond imagination. Those who hadn't faced impossible choices. The Irish annals speak of a failure of bread with terrible understatement. In reality, this meant death. It meant children crying from hunger. It meant the elderly quietly passing away because they refused to take food from younger mouths. It meant the strong sometimes taking from the weak. Here's what makes this particularly tragic. Agricultural societies develop complex systems of cooperation over centuries. Neighbors help neighbors. Villages support villages. These networks of mutual aid are the invisible foundation of civilization. But famine destroys these networks. It forces people into a terrible calculus of survival. Historical evidence suggests that some communities resorted to desperate measures that would have been unthinkable in normal times. Eating bark, eating leather, eating things no human should ever have to consume. The body's need for nourishment overwhelms every other consideration when starvation becomes real. And here's what most people never discover about prolonged famine. It doesn't just kill through immediate starvation, it weakens the body's defenses. It compromises the immune system. It transforms healthy populations into vulnerable populations. Diseases that a well-nourished body could fight off become deadly to a starving one. Infections spread more easily among the malnourished, and once disease gains a foothold in a weakened population, it can explode into epidemic. The famine of the late 530s was creating the perfect conditions for a catastrophe within a catastrophe. Millions of people across 3 continents were hungry, weak, and immunocompromised. Their bodies had been fighting for survival for years. Their resistance was depleted. It was as if the world had been softened up, prepared, made vulnerable for something worse. In the swamps of East Africa, in the warrens of Egypt's grain ports, in the holds of merchant ships sailing the Mediterranean, something was stirring. Something microscopic, something deadly beyond measure. A disease that would come to be known as the Plague of Justinian was preparing to emerge. And when it finally arrived, it would find a world already on its knees. A world that had no strength left to resist. But famine wasn't the worst thing coming. Something far more terrible was brewing in the shadows. In the year 541 AD, 5 years after the darkness began, something terrible arrived in Egypt. It came by ship, most likely. Perhaps in the grain holds of merchant vessels sailing from East Africa. Perhaps carried by rats that had stowed away in cargo. Perhaps transported by fleas that had bitten infected animals and now sought human hosts. Whatever its exact route, the plague of Justinian had arrived in the Mediterranean world, and nothing would be the same. Let me tell you what this disease actually was. Modern genetic analysis of ancient burial sites has confirmed what historians long suspected. The plague of Justinian was caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death 8 centuries later. It was bubonic plague, and it was about to tear through a population that had already been devastated by years of famine and hardship. The first reports came from the Egyptian port of Pelusium near the Nile Delta. Merchants and sailors began falling ill with the Ioanir frightening disease. Victims developed fever. Their lymph nodes swelled into painful egg-sized lumps called bobos. Many died within days. Some developed bleeding under the skin, turning their bodies dark with hemorrhage. Here's what made this plague so terrifying. It spread with incredible speed. The trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world, the same networks that had brought silk from China and spices from India, now carried death from port to port. Ships that left Pelusium carrying grain arrived at their destinations carrying plague. Sailors who had loaded cargo in the morning were dead before nightfall, and every port they touched became a new center of infection. The disease followed trade routes like a map. Alexandria fell, Antioch fell. The great cities of the eastern Mediterranean, one by one, succumbed to the pestilence. And here's what most people don't realize about the connection between the volcanic winter and the plague. Those years of famine had created the perfect conditions for epidemic disease. Populations were malnourished, immune systems were compromised. People who might have fought off a bacterial infection in normal times now had no reserves left. The plague spread through bodies that couldn't resist it. It found hosts who were already weakened by years of suffering. It exploited the vulnerability that the famine had created. There's also a possible ecological connection. Climate disruption may have affected rodent populations in East Africa, where Yersinia pestis is endemic in local wildlife. Changes in rainfall, temperature, or vegetation might have pushed infected rodents into closer contact with humans or with the rats that would carry the disease onto ships. We can't prove this connection definitively, but the timing is striking. A massive volcanic eruption in 536, years of climate disruption and famine, and then in 541, the worst plague the Mediterranean world had ever seen. It's as if nature had launched a 1-2 punch against human civilization. First, the darkness, then the plague, and humanity was reeling. But the full horror of the plague wouldn't become clear until it reached the greatest city in the Western world, until it reached Constantinople itself. Constantinople in the early 540s was the greatest city in the Western world. Perhaps 500,000 people lived within its walls and suburbs. It was the seat of empire, the center of trade, the jewel of civilization. And in 542 AD, it became a charnel house. Procopius, the same historian who had described the strange darkness of 536, was still living in Constantinople when the plague arrived. His account of what followed is one of the most harrowing documents from the ancient world. At the height of the epidemic, Procopius wrote, the death toll in Constantinople reached 10,000 people per day. Let that sink in. 10,000 human beings dying every single day, bodies piling up faster than they could be buried, faster than they could even be counted. The disease struck without discrimination, rich and poor, soldiers and scholars, priests and prostitutes. Even the Emperor Justinian himself contracted the plague. For days, the fate of the empire hung in the balance as the most powerful man in the Western world lay delirious with fever, his lymph nodes swollen, his life uncertain. Justinian survived remarkably, but his city was dying around him. Let me share what it must have been like to walk through Constantinople during those terrible months. The streets would have been silent or filled with the moans of the dying. Houses stood empty, their inhabitants all dead. Shops were closed, markets abandoned. The normal bustle of one of the world's great cities had been replaced by an eerie stillness. Procopius describes bodies lying unburied in the streets. He describes boats filled with corpses being rowed into the sea and dumped overboard when there was no more room in the cemeteries. He describes the towers of the city's walls being packed with bodies and sealed, converted into makeshift tombs. The living walked among the dead in a daze. Many of them knew they would soon be joining the corpses in those sealed towers. Here's what makes this account so remarkable. Procopius was not prone to exaggeration. He was a skeptical, practical man who served in government and military affairs. When he says 10,000 died per day, he means it. When he describes the horror, he is describing what he witnessed with his own eyes, and it went on for months. The plague didn't sweep through and leave. It lingered. It killed in waves. Just when people thought the worst was over, a new surge of death would begin. Modern estimates suggest that Constantinople may have lost 40 to 50% of its population during the initial outbreak. Half the city gone in a matter of months. And Constantinople was not unique. Across the Mediterranean, across the Middle East, across the trade routes of the ancient world, the plague was exacting the same terrible toll. Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, Rome, city after city fell to the pestilence. Let me share something most people never discover about this moment in history. This was the first recorded pandemic, the first time a disease had spread across such a vast geographic area with such devastating effect. The world had never seen anything like it, and it was far from over. Remember the world I described at the beginning of our journey? The Byzantine Empire at its peak, Justinian's grand ambitions, the dream of a restored Rome, all of that was now crumbling. Before the darkness and the plague, Justinian had seemed unstoppable. His general Belisarius had reconquered North Africa. His armies were pushing into Italy. The ancient Western Roman Empire, which had fallen decades earlier, seemed on the verge of resurrection under Byzantine rule. But an empire needs soldiers, and soldiers were dying by the thousands. Here's what most people don't realize about the plague's impact on military campaigns. An army isn't just a collection of fighters, it's a complex organization requiring supplies, transportation, coordination, and, crucially, healthy bodies. When half your troops are dead or dying, military operations become impossible. Justinian's Italian campaign ground to a halt. The forces that had been winning victories found themselves unable to maintain their gains. Reinforcements that should have arrived from Constantinople never came because there was no one left to send. And it wasn't just the military. The empire's entire administrative apparatus was collapsing. Tax collectors died, bureaucrats perished. The complex machinery of government that allowed a vast empire to function was breaking down. Here's the profound truth that emerges from this moment. Civilization is more fragile than we like to believe. It depends on countless people doing countless jobs, day after day, year after year. When too many of those people disappear, the system begins to fail. The economy of the Byzantine Empire entered a devastating spiral. With fewer workers, less food could be grown. With less food, more people starved. With fewer taxpayers, government revenues collapsed. With less revenue, public services deteriorated. Each problem amplified the others. Justinian, who had dreamed of matching the glory of ancient Rome, found himself ruling over ruins. The reconquest of the West, the great ambition of his reign, would never be completed. The resources simply weren't there anymore, and here's the fascinating part. The plague didn't strike once and disappear. It returned in waves over the following decades. Every time the population began to recover, another outbreak would sweep through. It was as if the disease was deliberately preventing human civilization from regaining its footing. Some historians estimate that the Mediterranean world lost between 30 and 50% of its population during the 6th century. In some regions, the losses may have been even higher. Entire villages disappeared, farmland reverted to wilderness, roads fell into disrepair as there weren't enough people to maintain them. Justinian himself lived until 565 AD, surviving the plague that had nearly killed him. But he ruled over a diminished empire, a shadow of what had been. The dream of a restored Rome died with the plague victims in those sealed towers. And this is where it gets truly fascinating, because the consequences of 536 AD didn't end with the Byzantine Empire, they rippled outward across the entire world, reshaping history in ways that would echo for centuries. Let me share something remarkable about the catastrophe of 536 AD. Its effects didn't respect political boundaries. They didn't care about empires or cultures or languages. The darkness and the plague reshaped the entire world, setting in motion changes that would define the next 1,000 years of human history. Consider the Sasanian Persian Empire, Byzantium's great rival to the east. The Persians had been locked in conflict with Constantinople for generations. They too suffered from the climate disaster and the plague. Their population declined, their economy struggled, their military strength diminished. Here's what most people never connect. The weakening of both Byzantium and Persia in the 6th century created a power vacuum, and in the following century, a new force would emerge from the Arabian Peninsula to fill that vacuum. The rise of Islam, which would transform the Middle East and beyond, was made possible in part by the devastation of the established powers during the 536 catastrophe. But let's look elsewhere. In the Balkans, the depopulation caused by plague created opportunities for migration. Slavic peoples began moving into territories that had been emptied by death. The ethnic composition of southeastern Europe was being rewritten. The modern nations of that region trace their origins, in part, to the movements that began in the wake of 536. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. Across the Atlantic, in Mesoamerica, the great city of Teotihuacan was entering its decline. Tree ring analysis shows severe drought conditions during exactly this period. While we can't prove a direct connection, the global climate disruption of the 530s likely affected the Americas as well. Teotihuacan had been one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Its collapse would reshape Mesoamerican civilization, creating space for the later rise of the Maya and eventually the Aztecs. In China, the political and social disruptions of the climate crisis contributed to ongoing instability during the period of division between North and South. The suffering of the common people, the famines, the hardships, left marks on Chinese society that would influence developments for generations. Historians have a term for large-scale shifts in human civilization. They call them catastrophic convergences, moments when multiple crises combine to accelerate historical change. The year 536 AD may be the most dramatic example in recorded history. A volcanic eruption triggers climate collapse. Climate collapse causes famine. Famine weakens populations. Weakened populations succumb to plague. Plague destroys governments, economies, and social structures. And from the ruins, a new world emerges. The ancient world, the world of Rome and Persia, of established empires and familiar patterns, was dying. What would replace it was something different, something we now call the early medieval period. For centuries, historians called this era the Dark Ages. The term is now considered misleading and pejorative, but it's not hard to understand why earlier scholars chose that name. They were looking at a period that genuinely seemed darker, less prosperous, less connected, less recorded than what had come before. And now we know why. The darkness wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. It began with a volcano, and it changed everything. But the story doesn't end with destruction. There are echoes of this catastrophe in unexpected places. Now, this is where history and mythology intertwine beautifully. Let me take you to the frozen lands of Scandinavia, to a people who would one day become the Vikings, and to legends that may carry echoes of 536 AD. The Norse mythology speaks of Fimbulwinter, the great winter that precedes Ragnarok, the end of the world. According to the legends, Fimbulwinter would last for 3 consecutive years, with no summer in between. Snow would fall from every direction. The sun would grow dim. The world would be plunged into darkness and cold before the final battle of the gods. Here's what's fascinating. Archaeological evidence shows that Scandinavia was devastated during the 530s and 540s. Settlement patterns were disrupted, farmsteads were abandoned, population declined dramatically. The region suffered terribly during the global climate crisis. Some researchers have proposed a provocative theory. Could the legend of Fimbulwinter be a cultural memory of 536 AD? Could the Norse myths carry in distorted form the trauma of those terrible years when the sun dimmed and summer never came? We can't prove this connection definitively. Mythology doesn't work like historical records. Stories change as they're passed from generation to generation. Details are added, removed, transformed. But the parallels are striking. Let me share something else about the Norse during this period. Archaeologists have found unusual gold deposits in Scandinavian soil from the 6th century. Massive quantities of gold jewelry, coins, and ornaments were buried in the ground and never retrieved. Why? Some scholars believe these were desperate offerings to the gods. In a time of crisis, when the sun refused to shine and crops refused to grow, people may have buried their most precious possessions as sacrifices. They were trying to appease whatever powers had brought this catastrophe upon them. The fact that this gold was never dug up suggests that the people who buried it died, or fled, or forgot where they had hidden their offerings. It's a haunting image. Gold glittering in the frozen earth, waiting centuries to be discovered, while those who buried it were long dead. And here's what makes this even more poignant. The Norse didn't know about volcanic eruptions in Central America. They didn't understand stratospheric aerosols or global climate systems. All they knew was that their world had been plunged into darkness, and they needed an explanation. So they wove that experience into their mythology. The sun goddess Sol was being chased by a great wolf named Skuld. One day, the wolf would catch her, and the world would end. Perhaps during those dark years of the 530s, the people of Scandinavia feared that the wolf had finally succeeded. This is what I find so beautiful about studying history. The same event, a volcanic eruption thousands of miles away, left different marks on different cultures. In Byzantium, it's recorded as history. In Scandinavia, it becomes mythology. In China, it's noted in court records, but it's all the same story, refracted through different human experiences. And the suffering wasn't limited to those initial years. The catastrophe of 536 was just the beginning of a decade of devastation. Here's the surprising twist that most people never learn. The year 536 AD wasn't an isolated disaster. It was the beginning of a decade that may have been the worst in recorded human history. Just as the world was beginning to recover from the initial volcanic winter, just as the skies were finally starting to clear, another massive eruption occurred. In 540 AD, the atmosphere was choked with volcanic debris once again. The ice cores from Greenland show a second massive sulfate spike corresponding to this year. Another eruption, another veil of particles blocking the sun, another wave of cold and darkness. This time, the world was already weakened. Whatever reserves people had saved were depleted. Whatever resilience communities had built was exhausted. And the second blow fell on a civilization that was already staggering. Let me share what this meant in practical terms. Imagine you're a farmer who barely survived the failed harvests of 536 and 537. By 539, things are finally improving. The sun is brighter, your crops are growing. You dare to hope that the worst is behind you. And then it happens again. The haze returns, the cold descends. Your fragile recovery is shattered. This is what happened across the Northern Hemisphere in the early 540s. The double punch of volcanic winters prevented any meaningful recovery. And then, as if the world hadn't suffered enough, the plague arrived in 541. Here's what's remarkable about the timing. The plague of Justinian emerged at precisely the moment when humanity was least able to resist it. After years of famine and deprivation, immune systems were compromised, medical resources were depleted, social structures were weakened. The plague found a world that had already been softened up for destruction. Modern researchers have analyzed this period using tree ring data from around the world. They've found that the 530s and 540s show the coldest temperatures of the past 2,000 years. Some years were so cold that trees barely grew at all. Their rings are thin, stunted, testimony to a planet in crisis. Population estimates for this period are uncertain but sobering. Some scholars believe that parts of Europe lost half their population or more. The Mediterranean world may have lost a third to half of its inhabitants. China suffered massive losses. Scandinavia was devastated. In absolute terms, tens of millions of people likely died during the 530s and 540s, perhaps hundreds of millions across the affected regions. We'll never know the exact numbers. There was no one left to count them. This was the darkest decade in human history, not just metaphorically, but literally. The sun was dimmed, the world was cold, people were dying by the millions, and civilization itself seemed on the verge of collapse. And yet, humanity survived. That's what I find most remarkable about this story. The volcanic winters should have ended us. The plague should have finished us off, but somehow, improbably, miraculously, our species endured. And eventually, the light began to return. After the darkest night, dawn eventually comes. And after the darkest decade in human history, the light slowly, painfully began to return. By the late 540s, the atmospheric effects of the volcanic eruptions were finally dissipating. The stratospheric debris that had blocked the sun for so long was gradually settling. The veil was lifting, the sun grew brighter. For the survivors, this must have seemed like a miracle. After years of dim skies and endless cold, to finally see a proper sunrise again, to feel genuine warmth on your face, to watch crops actually grow and ripen, but recovery wasn't instant. It couldn't be. Too much had been lost. Too many people had died. The agricultural infrastructure that supported civilization had been devastated. Fields that had been carefully cultivated for generations lay fallow. Irrigation systems had collapsed without workers to maintain them. Here's what I find most fascinating about this period of recovery: it reveals something profound about human resilience. Despite everything, despite the darkness and the famine and the plague, people began rebuilding, not because they had any guarantee of success, not because they knew the worst was over, simply because that's what humans do. We rebuild. Communities that had been scattered by disasters slowly reformed. Farms that had been abandoned were gradually reclaimed. Trade routes that had fallen silent began to see merchants again. The machinery of civilization, battered and diminished, started working once more. The population began to grow again, not quickly. The plague would return in waves throughout the 6th century, knocking back any gains. But the trend was upward. Life was reasserting itself. And here's something remarkable: the people who survived this catastrophe were, in a sense, the strongest and luckiest. They had lived through the unsurvivable. Their genes, their knowledge, their resilience were passed on to future generations. Some historians argue that the catastrophes of the 6th century actually accelerated certain kinds of innovation. When old systems collapse, new approaches become necessary. When traditional methods fail, experimentation becomes essential. Crisis, as terrible as it is, can also be a catalyst for change. New agricultural techniques emerged. New political structures developed. The relationship between churches and states evolved in the vacuum left by collapsing secular authorities. The medieval world that would follow was being shaped by the adaptations of this period. None of this diminishes the suffering that occurred: the deaths of millions of people, the destruction of thriving civilizations. These were genuine tragedies. But there's something comforting in knowing that even the worst catastrophe didn't end humanity. We endured, we adapted, we continued. The people of the 6th century didn't know if they were living through the end of the world. For all they knew, the darkness might never lift, the plague might never abate, but they kept going anyway. They planted crops, they raised children, they hoped, and eventually their hope was rewarded. The light returned, but the world that emerged from the darkness was not the same world that had entered it. Let me share something remarkable about what this all means for history. The catastrophe of 536 AD didn't just kill millions of people, it transformed the world. The civilization that emerged from the darkness was fundamentally different from what had come before. Consider the Byzantine Empire. Justinian's dream of a restored Rome was abandoned. The resources simply weren't there. Instead, the empire contracted, consolidated, focused on survival rather than expansion. The Byzantine state that would endure for another 9 centuries was shaped by the limitations imposed during this period. But here's what changed everything about the broader Mediterranean world. Both Byzantium and Persia, the two great powers that had dominated the region for centuries, were permanently weakened. They would continue fighting each other, exhausting themselves in endless wars. And when a new force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, neither empire had the strength to resist it. The rise of Islam is one of the most consequential events in world history, and while many factors contributed to it, the weakening of established powers during the 6th century catastrophe was undoubtedly one of them. The old world order had cracked. Something new could emerge. In Europe, the collapse of centralized authority accelerated the development of what historians call the early medieval period. Power became more localized. Landowners became more important as central governments weakened. The seeds of feudalism were being planted. Here's what most people don't realize about this transition. It wasn't experienced as a dark age by the people living through it. For them, it was simply life. They were adapting to new circumstances, finding new ways to organize society, developing new institutions to replace those that had failed. The Christian church grew in influence during this period. As secular authorities faltered, religious institutions provided continuity, education, and social services. Monasteries became centers of learning and agricultural innovation. Medieval church, that powerful institution that would shape European civilization for centuries, was strengthened by the crisis. And here's something fascinating about cultural memory. Over time, the specific causes of this transformation were forgotten. People knew that the ancient world had been different, more connected, more prosperous, more organized, but they didn't know about the volcanic eruption. They didn't understand the climate catastrophe. They just knew that something had changed long ago, and the world they lived in was the result. For centuries, historians used the term Dark Ages for this period without knowing how literally accurate that description was. The darkness wasn't just metaphorical, it wasn't just about lost knowledge or declining civilization. There had been actual physical darkness. The sun itself had dimmed. Now, thanks to ice cores and tree rings and advances in historical science, we finally understand. The medieval world didn't just emerge from the Roman world through gradual decline. It was born from catastrophe, forged in volcanic winter and plague, a new civilization rising from the ashes of the old. And that brings us to something important. What does 536 AD teach us today? And here's why this matters more than most people realize. The catastrophe of 536 AD isn't just ancient history, it contains lessons that remain profoundly relevant to our modern world. Consider what we've learned about volcanic risk. Somewhere on Earth, right now, magma is accumulating beneath the surface, pressure is building. The same forces that produced the eruption of 536 AD are still at work. We simply don't know when or where the next massive eruption will occur. Modern volcanologists monitor known calderas around the world. Satellites track volcanic activity. Early warning systems exist. We're far better prepared than 6th century humanity, but the underlying reality hasn't changed. A sufficiently large eruption could still affect global climate, could still dim the sun, could still threaten agriculture worldwide. The difference is that now we understand this risk. We can plan for it. We can develop strategies to protect food supplies, maintain social order, and support affected populations. Knowledge, in this case, is genuinely protective. Here's what the climate story teaches us. Human civilization exists within a relatively narrow band of climatic conditions. We've built our agriculture, our cities, our economies around the assumption of certain temperatures, certain seasons, certain patterns. When those patterns shift, even modestly, the consequences can be severe. This has obvious relevance to ongoing discussions about climate change. The past demonstrates that climate shifts, even relatively small ones, can have enormous effects on human societies. We are not separate from the natural world. We are embedded within it, dependent on its stability. And then there's the lesson of pandemic, disease. The plague of Justinian emerged at a time when populations were weakened and vulnerable. It spread along trade routes. It overwhelmed medical resources. It killed without discrimination. These patterns should sound familiar to anyone who has lived through recent years. The dynamics of epidemic disease haven't fundamentally changed. What has changed is our understanding. We know how diseases spread. We have vaccines, antibiotics, public health systems. But we also have dense cities, global travel, and interconnected supply chains that can accelerate spread. Here's what I find most important about this lesson. Complex civilizations are resilient, but they're also fragile in ways that aren't always obvious. The same trade networks that bring prosperity can also carry plague. The same agricultural abundance that supports large populations also creates vulnerability when harvests fail. The people of 536 AD didn't see the catastrophe coming, they had no warning. They simply woke up one day and the sun was dim. But we have the advantage of hindsight. We know what happened, we can learn from it. This doesn't mean we should live in fear. The message of 536 AD is not that catastrophe is inevitable or that civilization is doomed. The message is that understanding risks allows us to prepare for them, that human resilience is real and powerful, that even the worst disasters can be survived. Our ancestors lived through 536 AD, they survived the darkness, they rebuilt their world, and we are their legacy. Now, as you rest tonight, let me offer some final reflections on this remarkable story. As we near the end of our journey together, I want to share something about the human stories within this catastrophe. We've talked about empires and climates and diseases, but behind all of these large scale phenomena were individual people, ordinary men and women who loved, struggled, hoped, and survived. Imagine a mother in Constantinople watching her children grow thin during the years of famine. She doesn't know about volcanic eruptions or stratospheric particles. She only knows that there isn't enough food, and yet she finds ways to keep her family alive. She shares what little she has. She tells stories to distract from hunger. She maintains hope when hope seems foolish. Imagine a farmer in Ireland looking at another ruined harvest. He has worked this land all his life, as his father did before him. He knows its rhythms, its moods, its requirements. But now those rhythms are broken. The skills that served him so well are suddenly useless against an enemy he cannot see or understand. And yet, he keeps trying. He plants again. He hopes again. Imagine a monk in a remote monastery carefully recording the strange events of his time. A failure of bread, he writes. Just 3 words. But those words carry the weight of countless tragedies, and by writing them down, he ensures that future generations will know what happened. His simple act of record keeping has reached across 15 centuries to touch us tonight. Here's what I find most remarkable about these stories. The people of 536 AD had no guarantee of survival. They didn't know if the darkness would ever lift. They didn't know if the plague would ever abate. They didn't know if their world would ever recover. And yet, they kept going. They maintained their humanity in inhuman circumstances. They cared for each other, buried their dead with dignity, preserved what knowledge they could. They didn't give up. There's something deeply comforting in this. When we face our own challenges, our own dark moments, we're not facing them alone. We're part of a continuous human story that includes those resilient ancestors who survived the unsurvivable. They didn't have our technology, they didn't have our knowledge, they didn't have our resources. What they had was the same basic human spirit that we possess, the same capacity to endure, the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat. And here's the most beautiful part of this story. The darkness ended, the light returned, the world healed. Not quickly, not easily, but it healed, just as you are healing right now. Whatever challenges you've faced, whatever difficulties have dimmed your own internal light, know that darkness is never permanent. The human story is one of resilience, of recovery, of light returning after even the deepest night. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry this with you. You are the descendant of survivors. Your ancestors lived through 536 AD, through the plague, through countless other catastrophes that history has recorded and forgotten. Their strength lives in you. And now, let me offer a gentle closing to our journey. And so, as we come to the end of our journey through history's darkest year, I hope you found something valuable in this story. something that settles the mind, something that puts your own experiences into a larger perspective. We've traveled back nearly 1500 years tonight. We've stood in Constantinople as the sun dimmed. We've walked through Irish monasteries where monks recorded a failure of bread. We've seen the rise and fall of empires, the devastation of plague, the slow return of the light, and through all of it, one truth has remained constant. Humanity endures. The volcanic eruption of 536 AD should have ended us. The 18 months of darkness should have destroyed our civilizations. The plague should have finished what the famine started. But here we are, you and I, 15 centuries later, still here, still telling stories, still finding meaning in the experiences of those who came before. The sun dimmed, but it returned. The crops failed, but they grew again. The cities emptied, but they were rebuilt. Death swept through the world, but life reasserted itself as life always does. There's a profound peace in understanding this. Whatever darkness you might be experiencing in your own life, it is not permanent. Whatever challenges seem overwhelming right now, they will pass. The human story is one of survival, of resilience, of morning always following night. As your body relaxes now, as sleep approaches like a gentle tide, let these thoughts carry you into rest. You are part of something ancient and continuous. You carry within you the same strength that carried our ancestors through the worst decade in human history. The darkness of 536 AD has long since lifted. The world that emerged was different, yes, transformed certainly, but alive, continuing, growing, and you are part of that continuation. Rest well, my friend. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts soften. Let the stories of the past settle around you like a comfortable blanket. The light always returns. It returned in 537. It returned in 542. It returns every morning with the sunrise, and it will return for you in whatever form you need it. Sleep peacefully now. The darkness always gives way to light. Good night.